Somewhere beneath the ruins of a shattered century, a secret waits to be uncovered. The war that consumed the world between 1939 and 1945 was not only fought on visible battlefields, but in hidden laboratories, coded messages, and rooms that history never fully opened. Millions of ordinary people were swept into events so vast and so violent that the full truth has never been told in a single sitting. There are trains that vanished carrying impossible wealth, artworks that disappeared into the darkness of occupied Europe, and weapons that nearly changed the outcome of everything. Codebreakers worked by candlelight to unravel secrets that altered the fate of nations, and soldiers fought in landscapes so brutal that even the earth remembers them. The question is not whether you know the story of World War II, but whether you have ever heard the version that hides beneath the one you were taught. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where history breathes quietly in the dark and the great stories of our world are told, one slow sentence at a time. If you find comfort in these long historical journeys, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of storytelling you love. And if the spirit moves you, leave a comment tonight. Tell us where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you sit. There is something deeply peaceful about knowing that people in different cities and different time zones are settling into the same story at the same hour. Someone in Tokyo, someone in London, someone in a quiet room you will never see, all drifting toward the same history. And tonight that history is enormous. Take a slow breath. Let the day go. And now, let yourself drift into the story of the entire story of World War II. Chapter 1. The Broken Peace. How the world stumbled toward its darkest hour. There is a particular stillness that settles over the world just before something irreversible happens. A quiet that feels almost peaceful, almost hopeful, even as the cracks beneath it are spreading wide and deep. The story of how the world arrived at the most devastating conflict in human history did not begin with a single gunshot or a single decree. It began much earlier, in the exhausted aftermath of one catastrophe that had not yet finished reshaping the world when the seeds of the next were already taking root. The year was 1919. The Great War had ended, leaving behind a landscape of grief, shattered economies, and borders drawn and redrawn by the hands of exhausted statesmen gathered in the gilded halls of Versailles. What emerged from those negotiations was a document meant to secure a lasting peace. What it produced instead was something far more complicated. The Treaty of Versailles imposed upon Germany four great burdens, remembered by some historians under the simple arrangement of letters: the obligations of guilt, of reparations, of military restriction, and of territorial loss. The most painful among them was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which compelled Germany to accept sole and complete responsibility for the war. To the German people, this was not merely a legal declaration. It felt like a wound pressed into the public record, an inscription of humiliation upon a nation that had not yet stopped bleeding. The reparations that followed were staggering. A total bill of roughly 132 billion gold marks was fixed, a sum so vast it translated into decades of payments that would weigh upon German society like a stone tied around the neck of a swimmer already struggling to stay afloat. Militarily, Germany was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The army was capped at 100,000 men. Tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, an air force, all forbidden. The Rhineland, that long ribbon of German territory along the French frontier, was placed under Allied occupation. Germany was, in the plainest terms, rendered defenceless and diminished. And then there was the land. Roughly 13% of Germany's pre-war territory passed into other hands. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Polish state, newly created, received West Prussia, Posen, and parts of Silesia. The city of Danzig became a free city under the watchful eye of the League of Nations. The Saar region was placed under international administration. Germany's overseas colonies, every one of them, were stripped away. The republic that inherited this arrangement was young, fragile, and almost entirely unloved. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919 from the ruins of Imperial Germany, was asked to build a democracy atop a foundation of resentment and economic despair. Its electoral system, built on proportional representation, produced a fractured parliament in which no single party could ever gather enough strength to govern with confidence. Coalition followed coalition. Chancellor followed chancellor. The streets grew loud with competing factions, some marching under red banners, others under darker symbols still emerging from the margins of political life. And then the economy collapsed entirely. The hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923 was not merely an economic event. It was a slow unravelling of ordinary life. Prices that had been stable for a generation began to climb, then surge, then spiral beyond comprehension. By July of 1922, prices were rising by 50% in a single month. By November of 1923, a single American dollar could be exchanged for approximately 1,000 billion marks. The numbers had ceased to carry meaning. Workers who had spent decades building savings found those savings reduced to worthless paper. The middle class, the bedrock of civic stability, watched their wealth dissolve. Pensioners, families with insurance policies, men and women who had done everything correctly by every standard the old order had set, all of them were impoverished. Bread riots broke out. Farms were looted. The social fabric that had held German life together frayed and then tore. And in the spaces left by that tearing, something dark began to move. His name was Adolf Hitler. He had come to Munich as a former soldier, a man of no great social standing or formal education, shaped by the defeat of 1918 into something hard and certain and implacably angry. In September of 1919, acting on behalf of an army intelligence assignment to monitor a small right-wing gathering, he attended a meeting of a group called the German Workers' Party. He did not leave quietly, he joined, and he began to speak. By July of 1921, he was its chairman. The party had renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. Its platform, announced in February of 1920 across 25 points, promised to repudiate Versailles, restore German pride, and expel from national life those it blamed for Germany's humiliation. The ideology that underpinned it, National Socialism or Nazism, was something distinct from the traditional conservatism and nationalism that had long existed in European politics. It fused an extreme ultranationalism with the pseudo-scientific doctrine of racial hierarchy, proclaiming an Aryan master race and directing virulent hatred toward Jewish communities and toward the perceived enemies of German vitality. It rejected parliamentary democracy entirely, demanding in its place absolute loyalty to a single leader, a Führer, and the subordination of every individual, every institution, every thought to the will of the state. Central to this vision was a concept called Lebensraum, living space. It was an old idea rooted in late 19th century nationalist thought that held a nation must expand its territory to secure resources enough for its people to flourish. The Nazi Party transformed this idea into the centerpiece of its foreign ambition. Germany, it declared, must push eastward, into Poland, into the Soviet Union, to claim the agricultural lands and raw materials that would sustain the Aryan race for generations. The populations already living upon those lands, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Jews, were dismissed as inferior, their fates as irrelevant as the turning of a page. But before any of that could unfold, Hitler needed Germany itself. The path to power was not seized in a single violent stroke. It was built through a combination of mass spectacle and quiet calculation. Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine flooded the country with rallies, radio broadcasts, films and newspapers. Aircraft carried Hitler from city to city, each arrival stayed as the landing of a saviour. The Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown shirt, moved through the streets with an energy that was as much menace as movement, intimidating opponents, suppressing dissent, creating an atmosphere in which alternatives felt impossible. The Great Depression, arriving in 1929, destroyed what fragile stability remained. Banks collapsed. Unemployment surged. The Weimar Republic, already weakened, found itself unable to offer answers. Voters, frightened and angry, turned toward anyone who sounded certain. The Nazis surged at the polls. By January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, appointed with considerable confidence by conservative elites who believed they could manage him, by President Paul von Hindenburg. They could not manage him. On the 23rd of March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. By a vote secured through the exclusion of communist deputies, the intimidation of the remaining opposition, and the backing of the conservative DNVP, Hitler's cabinet was granted the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. In a single session, the architecture of German democracy was dismantled. Trade unions were dissolved. Political parties were outlawed, all of them, leaving only the NSDAP. Civil liberties were suspended. The legal framework for a totalitarian state was in place, and to make certain the consolidation held, the regime moved against its own. The Night of the Long Knives, carried out over June 30th and July 1st of 1934, or the extrajudicial murder of the SA leadership, most notably Ernst Röhm, the organization's commander, along with dozens of other perceived threats. The army, grateful for the removal of a rival, pledged its loyalty. The SS under Heinrich Himmler absorbed the functions of internal security, built and administered the concentration camp system, and became the principal instrument through which the regime would enforce its will. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 formalized what had until then been carried out through violence and social pressure. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages between Jews and ethnic Germans. The Reich citizenship law reduced Jewish people to mere subjects, stripped of civil rights, excluded from the life of the nation by statute. Centuries of prejudice were translated into the language of legislation. Persecution had become policy. Beyond Germany's borders, other forces were moving. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already demonstrated that democracy could be discarded without great difficulty. Rising in the turbulent years after the First World War, He had organised his black-shirt paramilitaries, crushed socialist opposition with the support of landowners and industrialists, and in October of 1922 marched thousands of his followers toward Rome, prompting King Victor Emmanuel III to invite him to form a government. Italian fascism was its own creation, built around the glorification of the state, the revival of Roman imperial imagery, a corporatist economic model, and the absolute authority of the Duke. It was a model that impressed Hitler, and the two regimes would eventually draw together into a common orbit. Farther east, the Empire of Japan was pursuing its own expansion. Through the 1930s, ultra-nationalist officer cliques within the Imperial Japanese Army, most notably the Kwantung Army, staged incidents and seized territories without waiting for civilian approval. In 1931, a false flag attack known as the Mukden Incident provided the pretext for the seizure of Manchuria and the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. By 1937, a clash at the Marco Polo Bridge had ignited a full-scale war with China. Japan was reshaping the Pacific by force of arms, driven by a conviction that Western powers would not intervene decisively enough to stop it. In November of 1936, Germany and Japan formalized their shared opposition to Soviet communism through the Anti-Comintern Pact. Italy joined in 1937. An axis of powers opposed to the existing international order was taking shape. The international body meant to prevent exactly this kind of breakdown was the League of Nations, established in 1920 with the highest hopes, but it had never had the strength its founders had imagined. The United States had never joined. Germany and the Soviet Union had been initially excluded. The League possessed no army of its own and depended entirely upon the willingness of its members to act collectively, a willingness that proved in crisis after crisis to be absent. When Japan seized Manchuria, the League condemned but did not stop it. When Italy invaded Abyssinia, the response was inadequate. The structural flaws were exposed, and the world slowly came to understand that the great institution of collective security was not equal to the forces arrayed against it. And so, as the 1930s advanced, much now depended upon the choices made in London and Paris. In March of 1936, German troops moved into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone that the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties had placed beyond Germany's military reach. It was a direct violation of international agreements. France and Britain, unprepared and unwilling to risk immediate conflict, chose not to respond with force. Diplomatic channels were pursued. The moment passed. In 1938, German troops crossed into Austria. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the Reich, was proclaimed on March the 12th, following weeks of political pressure and intimidation that had forced the Austrian Chancellor to resign. A plebiscite was conducted afterward, its results shaped by the regime's full apparatus of influence claiming near-total Austrian support. The former nation was absorbed as the Ostmark, its institutions dissolved, its army folded into the Wehrmacht, Nazi law imposed throughout. Almost immediately, attention turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically to the Sudetenland, that border region inhabited by a large ethnic German population. Hitler demanded its cession. German troops massed on the frontier. The world held its breath. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany. He met with Hitler. He flew again. He negotiated. On September 29, 1938, in Munich, the agreement was signed. Britain, France, Italy and Germany, without a single representative of Czechoslovakia present at the table. The Sudetenland would be ceded. In exchange, Hitler promised that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London with a piece of paper and, standing before the cameras, spoke of peace for our time. The words were received with enormous relief by a population that had lived through one world war and wished desperately never to see another. But among others, the words rang hollow almost before they had faded. Winston Churchill, a backbench member of Parliament who had been warning since 1935 that Nazi Germany represented a menace to civilization, called it a total and unmitigated defeat. He was not alone. Thomas Mann, Anthony Eden, Albert Einstein, voices from across the spectrum of Western thought had been sounding the alarm for years, warning that a state built upon such ideology, pursuing such ambitions, could not be contained by concession. They were proven right in March of 1939, when German forces occupied the remaining Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The promise made in Munich was abandoned as though it had never been spoken. The response, when it came, was in the form of guarantees. Britain and France pledged to defend Polish sovereignty. But before any military response could be organised, a far quieter agreement remade the map of Eastern Europe in secret. On August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Premier Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow. The public document pledged that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other. The secret protocols attached to it divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland was carved along the line of the Narew, Vistula and San rivers, the west to Germany, the east to the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, Finland and the Romanian province of Bessarabia fell within the Soviet sphere. With a single document, two ideological enemies had made themselves partners in the dismemberment of the lands between them. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Roughly 60 divisions, over 1,000 aircraft and thousands of tanks struck from multiple directions. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields, railways and communications. Army Group North drove from Pomerania and East Prussia. Army Group South pushed through Silesia and Slovakia. The strategy was the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, designed to overwhelm before coherent defence could be organised. The Polish Air Force was destroyed. Panzer columns cut through the defensive lines. The campaign moved with a terrible speed. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honouring the guarantee they had pledged. But the declaration, whatever moral weight it carried, brought no immediate relief to Poland. On September 17th, the Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border. The secret protocol was being fulfilled. Eastern Poland fell into Soviet hands. The Polish government, unable to hold, crossed into Romania. By the 6th of October, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state. Divided between two empires, its territory absorbed, its people subject to occupations that would prove in the years ahead to be among the most brutal the modern world had known. And yet, for all that had happened, a strange stillness descended upon the Western Front. Britain and France had declared war, but no great offensive came. The months that followed, September 1939 through May 1940, were marked by a curious absence of combat on land. Minor naval skirmishes, aerial reconnaissance, occasional bombardment. A period that would come to be called the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg. 8 months of uneasy quiet, as if the world was drawing a long breath before what was to come. The invasion of Poland had shattered the last illusions of peace, but what followed would prove that the world had not yet seen the full devastating power of the war machine now unleashed upon it. Chapter 2: Blitzkrieg and the Burning West. Europe falls and Britain stands alone. There is something almost dreamlike about the silence that settles over Europe in the autumn of 1939. Poland has fallen. The guns have stilled along its shattered roads and broken cities, and yet in the west, along the long frontier between France and Germany, almost nothing moves. Soldiers wait in their trenches, officers study their maps, diplomats exchange careful words, the world holds its breath. This strange quiet has a name. History would come to call it the Phony War. From September 1939 until the spring of 1940, the Western Front remains largely inactive. Britain and France have declared war on Germany, but neither side seeks a decisive clash. The Allies are mobilizing millions of men, leaning on economic blockades, and watching carefully while Germany consolidates what it has already won. Germany, for its part, holds the bulk of its divisions back, waiting for the right moment to move, and the silence is not peace, it is preparation. But before the West truly awakens, Germany looks north. In April 1940, German forces simultaneously invade Denmark and Norway. Denmark falls almost immediately, seized as a staging ground, its air and naval bases folded into Germany's expanding defensive network. Norway is the deeper prize. Its ice-free ports, especially the city of Narvik in the far north, carry the Swedish iron ore that feeds Germany's war industry. Its rugged coastline offers harbours for U-boats and airfields from which German power can reach out into the Atlantic. Within weeks, both nations are under German control, and the northern flank is secured. Then comes May, and with May comes the storm. The plan the Germans carry into France in 1940 bears almost no resemblance to the long grinding offensives of the First World War. That earlier conflict had been defined by massive infantry assaults, prolonged artillery bombardments, and the slow, terrible advance across entrenched ground. The armies of 1914 had bled themselves dry trying to push through fortified lines along predictable axes of advance. Germany's commanders in 1940 have studied those failures with cold precision. The doctrine they have developed is known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Its principles had been forged in the interwar years by officers like Heinz Guderian, whose writings on unmechanised warfare formed the doctrinal backbone of the new approach. The idea was elegant in its ruthlessness. Rather than attacking everywhere with equal force, massed columns of tanks and motorized infantry would concentrate on a single decisive point, a Schwerpunkt, and break through before the enemy could respond. Close air support from dive bombers would suppress resistance and shatter communications. Short, intense artillery barrages would achieve surprise rather than prolonged bombardment. And a decentralized command structure, built around radio communication, would allow frontline commanders to make decisions in real time, rather than waiting for orders to travel up and down rigid chains of command. The specific plan for France, shaped significantly by the General Erich von Manstein, hinges on a gamble. Rather than advancing through Belgium in a broad sweep as the Allies expect, the main German thrust will cut through the Ardennes forest. This thick, hilly, densely wooded region had long been dismissed by Allied planners as effectively impassable for a large mechanized force. The roads through it are few and narrow. the terrain seems to forbid the movement of armoured columns, and so the French have left it lightly defended, anchoring their faith instead in the Great Maginot Line that runs along the Franco-German border to the south. The Maginot Line is an extraordinary structure. Built through the 1930s, its construction beginning in 1929 and running through to the eve of war, it stretches along France's eastern frontier as a system of concrete forts, underground barracks, artillery casemates, and anti-tank obstacles. It is by any measure a formidable wall, but it is also a wall with a gap. It does not extend far enough north to cover the Ardennes sector, and the French strategy has always assumed that the forest itself would fill that gap. What France has built, in essence, is an answer to the last war, when the threat had come from the east along predictable lines. On the 10th of May 1940, the German offensive begins. Airborne troops drop into the Netherlands and Belgium. Armoured columns roll westward. Allied forces, moving to meet what they believe is the main German thrust through Belgium, advance northward just as planned. And while they do, the real blow is already falling in the Ardennes. German infantry and armour, threading through narrow forest roads in tight columns, push forward with remarkable speed. Within days they have crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on the 13th and 14th of May, and the panzer columns swing north and west in a great arc toward the English Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium are being encircled. The front is not merely broken, it is dissolving. The speed of the collapse is difficult to absorb even in retrospect. By late May, more than 400,000 British and French troops are trapped against the sea near the port city of Dunkirk. There is no way to fight their way out. The only question is whether they can be taken off the beaches before the Germans close the trap entirely. What follows becomes one of the most quietly remarkable moments of the entire war. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, working from his headquarters in the chalk tunnels beneath Dover Castle, organises a rescue operation of extraordinary complexity. Warships, merchant vessels, and hundreds of civilian craft, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, river launches, lifeboats, craft of every conceivable shape and size, gather at the ports of southern England. These small vessels, crewed sometimes by volunteers with little more than courage and local knowledge, make their way across the channel to the shallow beaches where soldiers stand in long patient lines, waiting in the water. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, Operation Dynamo unfolds. More than 338,000 soldiers are brought home. British, French, Belgian, Dutch and Polish men carried across the grey Channel waters on whatever will float. On the first day alone, more than 100 civilian craft rescue over 68,000 men. The evacuation does not win any battle. France is still falling, but it preserves an army and with it the possibility of continuing the war. France itself does not last much longer. The second phase of the German offensive, known as Fall Rot, begins on the 5th of June. German forces cross the Somme and the Aisne, overwhelming the remaining French divisions. Italy enters the war on the 10th of June, opening a new front in the southeast. The French government flees Paris on the 11th of June. The capital, declared an open city, is occupied by German troops on the 14th without a shot fired in its defence. Negotiations for an armistice begin on the 18th of June. The document is signed on the 22nd and takes effect on the 25th. Under its terms, Germany occupies the northern and western 3/5 of France, including all the Atlantic and Channel ports. The remaining southeastern region is left nominally sovereign under a new government, headquartered in the quiet spa town of Vichy, under the leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain is a celebrated figure from the First World War, a man many French citizens associate with honour and sacrifice. Now he signs the armistice and becomes the head of what will come to be remembered as a collaborationist state. The proud republic's old motto of liberty, equality and fraternity is replaced. The new words are work, family, fatherland. Not everyone accepts the armistice. On the 18th of June, a French general named Charles de Gaulle, relatively obscure before that moment, speaks from a radio studio in London. His words are simple and defiant. France has lost a battle, he says, but France has not lost the war. The British government recognises him as the leader of Free France 10 days later. He begins building the Forces Françaises Libres from the troops who have escaped to Britain, from French colonists and expatriates, from units in Africa and across the empire. It is a small beginning, but it is a beginning. Across the Channel, Britain now stands alone, and the question on every mind in London and Berlin alike is whether it will stand for long. Germany's answer is codified in a plan called Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of the British Isles, to be launched after the Luftwaffe has secured air superiority over the Channel and the south of England. The key word is after. Before any landing craft can put troops ashore, the Royal Air Force must be destroyed. And so begins the Battle of Britain. The battle unfolds in phases across the summer and autumn of 1940. In the early weeks, German aircraft strike at coastal shipping and ports. Then the attacks intensify against airfields and radar installations. By August and into September, large formations of German bombers, escorted by fighters, sweep over the fields and towns of southeastern England in the largest aerial campaign the world has yet seen. Commanding the German air assault is Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, who leads his air fleets with characteristic confidence. Facing him is a quieter and far less celebrated figure, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding's contribution to the battle is not merely tactical. In the years before the war, he had overseen the construction of an integrated air defence system of extraordinary sophistication. Modern fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, had been developed and placed in production. A network of radar stations known as Chain Home stretched along the British coast, capable of detecting incoming German formations while they were still over the Channel. The data from these stations flowed into a centralised command network, combined with reports from the Observer Corps on the ground, and plotted in great operations rooms where controllers could direct squadrons precisely to where they were needed. The Chain Home system, transmitting powerful radio pulses from tall steel masts and measuring the echoes that bounced back from approaching aircraft, gave the RAF something priceless. Time. Several crucial minutes of advance warning. Enough time to scramble fighters, to climb to altitude to be in position when the German formations arrived. Without it, the defenders would have been perpetually reacting. With it, they could anticipate. The battle is not one-sided. Through the summer months, the losses on both sides are severe. Britain loses roughly 1,012 aircraft. Germany loses approximately 1,918. The pilots who fly for Fighter Command, men from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a dozen other nations, are stretched to the edge of endurance. They fly multiple sorties a day. They sleep in their cockpits between scrambles. They watch friends disappear from formation and do not speak of it. In early September, Germany shifts its strategy. Rather than continuing to hammer the airfields that are slowly grinding down the RAF's capacity, the Luftwaffe turns its weight against London itself. On the 7th of September 1940, the first great raid falls on the capital. The Blitz has begun. For the next months, and then stretching on until May of the following year, German bombers arrive over Britain's cities night after night. London absorbs the greatest weight of the assault, bombed repeatedly as the docks burn and the streets fill with smoke and rubble. But Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry, Plymouth, Bristol, Manchester and Portsmouth all endure their own terrible nights. By the time the campaign ends, approximately 43,500 British civilians have been killed, and yet the people endure. Families take shelter in the great tunnels of the London Underground, in corrugated steel Anderson shelters buried in their gardens, in Morrison shelters crouched beneath dining tables, in reinforced basements and railway arches and communal street shelters. They emerge after each raid to find their streets altered, to clear rubble, to repair what can be repaired, and to continue. Shops post wry signs in their shattered windows. Community defence groups, the Home Guard, the Air Raid Precaution Service, the Auxiliary Fire Service, work through the nights alongside ordinary residents. There is fear, there is grief, but there is also something quieter and more stubborn, a collective determination not to be broken. The voice that speaks most publicly for that determination belongs to the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had come to power in May 1940. His speeches during this period are among the most carefully crafted uses of language in modern political history. He does not promise comfort. He promises struggle and endurance and eventual victory. When he tells Parliament that never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few, he is speaking of the pilots of Fighter Command. But he is also speaking to something wider, to the entire nation and to the watching world. That watching world includes, crucially, the United States. Although America has not yet entered the war, it is not standing entirely apart. President Franklin Roosevelt proposes what becomes the Lend-Lease arrangement in December 1940, and the legislation is signed into law in March 1941. Under its terms, the United States will supply Britain, and eventually the Soviet Union and other Allied nations, with food, oil, weapons, and materiel. The understanding is that such aid is essential to American defense itself. Britain had already been receiving significant military supplies before the formal program begins. Now the flow becomes a river. From across the empire, other support arrives as well. Commonwealth nations pool their foreign exchange reserves, contributing roughly £2 billion in total. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India fight alongside British forces. Their presence is felt not only in the counting of lives, but in the quiet web of shared purpose that sustains a nation under siege. On the other side of the Channel, Germany's strategic situation by late 1940 is one of paradox. The Wehrmacht controls a vast sweep of Europe from the Atlantic coast to the German border. France is neutralized. The Western continent has been subdued with astonishing speed, and yet the war does not end. Britain remains defiant and unreachable across the narrow water. Operation Sea Lion is quietly set aside. Its requirements, air superiority, control of the channel, adequate landing craft, trained amphibious forces, impossible to meet in the face of British resistance and naval dominance. Germany's war economy, meanwhile, is hungry. The conquered Western lands cannot provide the oil, grain, raw materials and labour that sustain the industrial machine of a nation at war. And Hitler's strategic vision has always looked eastward. In his writings and in his long-held ideology, the vast lands of the Soviet Union represent both the living space his nation requires and the racial and political enemy that he regards as existential. By late 1940, planning for a massive Eastern campaign is already underway. On the margins of Europe, other campaigns continue to develop. In North Africa, Italy moves against British positions in Egypt in September of 1940, advancing from its Libyan bases. But the British response, beginning in December 1940 with an operation called Compass, is swift and devastating. Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force, the Italian 10th Army, sweeping it out of Egypt across Cyrenaica and into the Gulf of Sirte. 10 Italian divisions are destroyed. Around 138,000 prisoners are taken, along with hundreds of tanks and guns. It is one of the most complete military reversals of the war's early years. But the balance shifts again in February 1941, when a German general named Erwin Rommel arrives in North Africa with the Afrika Korps. He brings with him the aggressive mobile tactics of the Blitzkrieg and a personal energy that transforms the campaign almost overnight. Within weeks, he has reversed British gains, retaken Cyrenaica, and begun pressing toward Egypt. The Desert War, which had seemed nearly won, becomes something far more complex and protracted. And so the Western story settles into an uneasy equilibrium as 1940 gives way to 1941. Britain stands, bruised but unbroken. The Blitz continues through the winter nights. The pilots of Fighter Command rest and are replaced. The little ships that crossed to Dunkirk have long since returned to their harbours. Somewhere in the cellars of an English country house called Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists work in quiet rooms to unravel the coded communications that flow between German ships, aircraft and commands, reading naval Enigma traffic, listening to the signals of the Luftwaffe, beginning to see into the machinery of German planning. Europe is changed beyond recognition. Ancient nations have been occupied. Governments have fled into exile or signed their compromises with the conqueror. A continent that had imagined itself stable has discovered how quickly the familiar world can dissolve. While Britain endured the bombs and held its ground in the West, the true weight of the coming war was about to fall upon a nation that had signed a pact believing it had bought itself time. But time, as events would prove, was already running out. Chapter 3: Operation Barbarossa and the Global War, the Eastern Front, Pearl Harbor, and the expanding abyss. In the long and shadowed chronicle of the Second World War, there came a moment when the conflict ceased to be merely a European struggle and became something far larger, far darker, and far more difficult to contain. That moment arrived in the summer of 1941, carried on the pre-dawn silence of a Sunday morning, when the largest land invasion in human history began to unfold across an almost incomprehensible stretch of the earth. It was the 22nd of June, 1941. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the stillness along a front of nearly 3,000 kilometers was shattered. From the Arctic coast in the far north, down through the Baltic states and the vast plains of Belarus, all the way to the shores of the Black Sea in the south, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. A Approximately 3,400 tanks rolled forward through the pre-dawn darkness, and above them nearly 2,700 aircraft moved across the sky towards Soviet airfields that were, in many places, still sleeping. Adolf Hitler had given this campaign its name, Operation Barbarossa. Publicly, he framed it as a crusade, a war between worldviews, a struggle to destroy what he called Jewish Bolshevism, and to secure for Germany the vast territories of the East that he believed were her destiny. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space, and of grain fields in Ukraine, of oil flowing from the Caucasus, of labour that could sustain a German empire for generations. Beneath those declarations lay something colder and more calculating, a conviction that the Soviet structure was rotten at its foundations, that it would collapse within weeks beneath the weight of a swift German blow, and that Britain, deprived of any hope of a powerful Eastern ally, would be forced at last to make peace. Hitler was not alone in underestimating the Soviet Union. The Red Army, for all its enormous size, had been profoundly weakened by the years just before the invasion. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin had turned on his own officer corps with a ferocity that left institutional scars which had not fully healed. Roughly 24,000 officers of all ranks had been dismissed. Nearly 10,000 were arrested. More than 780 senior commanders were executed, including 3 of the 5 highest-ranking generals the Red Army possessed. The men who replaced them were often younger, often less experienced, and almost always more cautious about expressing independent judgment in a system that punished initiative and rewarded obedience. The consequences ran deeper than the loss of individual commanders. Unit cohesion had been shattered. Decades of accumulated military knowledge had been swept away. Along the new western border, fortifications remained unfinished. Less than half of the required defensive structures had been completed, and only a third of the needed officers had been assigned to staff them. Equipment was plentiful on paper, but far less reliable in reality. Of the Red Army's 23,000 tanks, only about 2/3 were serviceable, and many of those lacked radios, spare parts, and the transport trucks needed to sustain an armoured force in motion. Still, the invasion did not have to be the catastrophe it became. Throughout the spring of 1941, warnings had reached Moscow from nearly every direction. Soviet agents in Europe reported large concentrations of German troops along the border. Diplomatic missions from Britain and France passed along intelligence of impending attack. Decoded military telegrams pointed toward a rapid thrust into Soviet territory, and yet Stalin dismissed them all. He trusted the non-aggression pact he had signed with Hitler in 1939. He believed that Germany would not open a second front while still engaged in the West. He suspected that the intelligence was disinformation designed to draw the Soviet Union into a premature war. And so the frontier forces waited, thinly spread and under strength, without sufficient supplies or clear orders, as the German columns prepared to move. When the blow fell, it fell with devastating force. In the first week alone, roughly 600,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. In the weeks that followed, the losses mounted with a speed and scale that was almost difficult to comprehend. The 3 German army groups, north driving toward Leningrad, center pushing through Belarus toward Moscow, and south sweeping into Ukraine, advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, leaving behind them enormous pockets of encircled Soviet forces. At Smolensk, German forces trapped large elements of the Soviet Western Front, forcing a surrender of men and material that briefly delayed the advance on Moscow, but nonetheless represented a profound tactical defeat. At Kiev, in one of the largest encirclement operations in military history, German armoured columns from north and south closed a pocket around the Soviet southwestern front. Between 600,000 and 700,000 Soviet troops were trapped. Only a few thousand escaped. It was the largest single capture of troops the world had seen. At Vyazma, as the Germans launched their autumn offensive toward Moscow, 3 Soviet armies were encircled near the town, and roughly 500,000 more soldiers were captured. The Soviet defensive capability in that sector was, for a time, nearly destroyed. And yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. It bent, and bent further, and bent still more, but it did not break. The German offensive toward Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, began on the 30th of September 1941. By early December, German forward units had reached positions some 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. The spires of the Soviet capital were, in some accounts, visible to German soldiers through field binoculars. But between those soldiers and the city stood defensive lines that had been hastily but determinedly constructed, and behind those lines stood a man who had been placed in command of the defense of Moscow itself. General Georgy Zhukov had spent the summer and autumn reorganizing shattered Soviet formations, building new defensive positions, and waiting for the reinforcements he knew were coming. Fresh divisions had been transferred from the Soviet Far East after a diplomatic agreement with Japan reduced the threat on that frontier. These Siberian troops, accustomed to the cold, well-equipped for winter warfare, and rested in ways that the exhausted German forces were not, began to arrive at the front in the closing weeks of November. On the 5th of December 1941, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive. More than 1 million soldiers were thrown into the fight against German formations that had been advancing for months through a Russian winter, for which they were profoundly unprepared. German soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Their supply lines were frozen. Equipment seized and failed in temperatures that fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Over the weeks that followed, the Red Army drove the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers from Moscow, ending the immediate threat to the capital and delivering the first major strategic defeat that Nazi Germany had suffered on the Eastern Front. It was a moment of immense significance. The campaign that Hitler had promised would be finished in weeks had become something else entirely. A grinding, attritional war on a front of unimaginable scale against an enemy that refused to stop fighting. But the suffering along the Eastern Front was not only military. Behind the advancing German lines, mobile killing units known as the Einsatzgruppen moved through the occupied territories, carrying out a systematic campaign of murder against Jewish communities. Soviet political officials, Roma, the disabled, and others the Nazi regime had marked for elimination. These paramilitary squads drawn from the SS and security police worked alongside the Wehrmacht, the order police and local auxiliaries, rounding up populations and shooting them in ravines, fields and forests across the occupied East. In September 1941, at a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev called Babi Yar, German SS units and their Ukrainian auxiliaries gathered the Jewish residents of the city over 2 days, the 29th and 30th of that month, and murdered 33,771 people. The ravine fell silent afterward, but the killing did not stop. Babi Yar would be used for further executions of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and Ukrainian civilians until Soviet forces liberated Kiev in 1943. Soviet prisoners of war endured their own particular horror. Captured in enormous numbers, they were denied adequate food, shelter, and medical attention. They were given rations of thin soups, rotting vegetables, and bread mixed with sawdust. Many were left exposed to the elements. Others were forced into labour under conditions designed to exhaust and destroy. Of the estimated 5,700,000 Soviet soldiers who fell into German captivity, roughly 3,300,000 would die there. The systematic nature of these atrocities was not accidental. At a conference held on the 20th of January 1942 in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, senior Nazi officials and SS leaders gathered to formalise the logistical framework for what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting, convened by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, coordinated the participation of government ministries in the deportation of Jews from German-occupied Europe to extermination camps in occupied Poland, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, where industrial-scale killing with gas chambers was to be carried out. What had begun in the East as mass shootings was being formalised and expanded into a bureaucratic machinery of genocide. As these events unfolded across the Soviet Union and occupied Europe, the war was also moving toward a transformation in the Pacific. Japan, an empire that had been expanding aggressively through Asia since the early 1930s, had spent years pursuing a vision of regional dominance it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a network of territories under Japanese political and economic control, framed publicly as liberation from Western colonialism, but sustained in practice by military conquest and resource extraction. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which had begun in July 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, had drawn Japan into a prolonged and costly conflict on the Chinese mainland. The war consumed vast quantities of oil, metal, and material that Japan could not produce domestically. The need for these resources drove Japan's leadership to look southward toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of British Malaya, and the other resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The United States had watched this expansion with increasing alarm. In August 1941, responding to Japan's occupation of French Indochina and the ongoing war in China, the Roosevelt administration froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo that cut off roughly 9/10 of Japan's oil imports. For Japanese military planners, this was a crisis without an easy solution. Without oil, the fleet could not sail. Without the fleet, the empire could not be defended or expanded. The clock had begun to run down. Japan's senior military leadership concluded that only a rapid seizure of Southeast Asian resources could avert collapse, and that seizing those resources required neutralizing the United States Pacific Fleet before it could interfere. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet, had drafted a plan. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo secured the approval of Emperor Hirohito and the Imperial General Headquarters. The decision was made. On the morning of Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, 353 Japanese carrier-based aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, rising in 2 successive waves from the grey surface of the Pacific, and descended on the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack began at 7:48 in the morning Hawaiian time. 4 American battleships were sunk: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California. 3 others were severely damaged. More than 180 American aircraft were destroyed. 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 were wounded. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the United States Congress and opened his speech with words that would be remembered for as long as the event itself. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan within hours. 4 days later, the 11th of December, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. His reasoning was a mixture of strategic calculation and ideological conviction. He believed the United States would be preoccupied with Japan, and therefore unable to meaningfully aid Britain or the Soviet Union. He believed that American naval provocations against German shipping had already made conflict inevitable. He saw an opportunity to allow German submarines unrestricted attacks on American vessels in the Atlantic. And he was convinced, as he had been convinced about so many things, that his enemies had underestimated him. Japan, meanwhile, moved with startling speed across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within days of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong simultaneously. Hong Kong fell on the 25th of December. Manila fell in May 1942. Japanese troops swept down the Malayan Peninsula through terrain the British had considered impassable, and on the 15th of February 1942, the garrison of Singapore, 85,000 British, Indian, Australian and local troops under Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, surrendered to General Tomoyuki Yamashita. It was the largest single surrender of British-led forces in history, and Winston Churchill would later describe it as the worst disaster in British military history. The fortress that had been called the Gibraltar of the East had fallen in a matter of weeks. Further conquests followed in rapid succession. Burma was invaded in January and Rangoon was taken by early March. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil, fell through February and March 1942. Rabaul in New Guinea was seized, establishing a broad defensive perimeter that stretched across most of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. For the Filipino and American soldiers who had surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, what followed the capitulation was a different kind of ordeal. Beginning on the 9th of April 1942, between 72,000 and 78,000 prisoners were forced to march roughly 66 miles through heat and deprivation to Camp O'Donnell. They were given almost no food or water. Those who fell were beaten or shot. Thousands died along the road. The march continued until the 17th of April. It would become known as the Bataan Death March. Against this tide of Axis expansion, the Allied nations began slowly and deliberately to find a common purpose. In December 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Arcadia Conference in Washington, where they reaffirmed what would become known as the Germany First strategy, the agreement that defeating Nazi Germany in Europe was the paramount objective to which the greatest share of Allied military and industrial resources would be committed, with the Pacific Theatre receiving what remained. On the 1st of January 1942, they issued the Declaration by United Nations, joined by the Soviet Union, China and the British Dominions, pledging a common effort against the Axis powers. The United States, once it had committed itself to the war, brought with it an industrial capacity that no other nation on Earth could match. Factories converted to war production, Unemployment fell to depths not seen in decades. The output of aircraft, ships, vehicles, and armaments expanded at a pace that would eventually make the American contribution to the Allied cause decisive. The Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt and Churchill had signed in August 1941 aboard ships anchored in Placentia Bay, had already laid out a vision of the post-war world built on self-determination, freedom, and cooperation. A vision that stood in deliberate contrast to the order the Axis powers were imposing by force. But between that vision and its realization lay an ocean of uncertainty and loss. In the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled in coordinated wolf packs, sinking hundreds of Allied merchant vessels, threatening to cut the supply lines that carried food, fuel and war materials from North America to Britain and beyond. The struggle to keep those lines open, the longest continuous campaign of the entire war, consumed enormous resources and claimed thousands of lives on both sides. The war, by the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942, had become something that no single map could contain. It stretched from the frozen plains east of Moscow to the Coral Islands of the Pacific. It moved beneath the surface of the Atlantic and burned in the jungles of Malaya. It had consumed millions of lives and was consuming more with every passing week. With the war now stretching from the frozen plains of Russia to the Coral Islands of the Pacific, the question was no longer how the war had begun, but whether the forces now gathering against the Axis could find a way to turn its terrible momentum. Chapter 4: The Turning of the Tide, Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, and the secret wars behind the battles. By the opening days of 1942, the world was caught in a vast and darkening struggle, its outcome still deeply uncertain. Japan had shattered the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and in the months that followed, conquest after conquest unfolded across Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed. Singapore fell in February. Java surrendered before the month of March had passed. The islands of Bataan held out until April, and Mandalay fell not long after. Across the Pacific and through the jungles and archipelagos of the Far East, the forces of Imperial Japan seemed, for a moment, unstoppable. In Europe, Germany remained dominant across the continent, though its reserves were thinning, stretched between the grinding enormity of the Eastern Front and the shifting sands of North Africa, where Rommel's forces were preparing another offensive. The Allies, though comparatively well supplied, were spread thin across too many theatres, too many coastlines, too many distant fronts. The balance of the war had not yet tipped, but it was about to. Somewhere in the vast silence of the Pacific Ocean, a secret was forming. In the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor, a small team of American cryptanalysts worked quietly, without fanfare, in what was called Station Hypo. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, a meticulous and gifted officer who possessed that rare combination of mathematical instinct and patient intuition. His team had been labouring over the Japanese naval code known as JN-25, tracing its patterns, untangling its encrypted layers, slowly drawing meaning from what had appeared to be impenetrable noise. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team had made a discovery of enormous consequence. The Japanese Navy was planning a major offensive strike against a location identified in their coded messages only by the letters A and F. 2 letters, a mystery within a mystery. But Rochefort believed he knew the answer. He believed AF referred to Midway Island, the small but strategically vital atoll sitting in the Central Pacific. To confirm this, Rochefort devised an elegant and quiet deception. He arranged for a false radio transmission to be sent from Midway, reporting a shortage of fresh water in the island's evaporators, a deliberately constructed fiction broadcast openly enough that Japanese intercept stations would hear it. Within days, intercepted Japanese communications confirmed that AF was running low on fresh water. The deception had worked. AF was Midway. What followed was one of the most consequential naval battles in history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, trusting the intelligence his codebreakers had delivered, positioned 3 American carriers north of Midway, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, and waited. The Japanese fleet advanced, confident in the element of surprise they believed they still possessed. They did not know that the Americans were already there. On the 4th of June 1942, American aircraft swept down upon the Japanese carrier force. The early torpedo plane attacks were costly and, in many cases, fatal for the crews who flew them. But they drew away the Japanese fighter cover, and then came the dive bombers. In the space of a few minutes, a few terrible, decisive minutes, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were set ablaze. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to strike back, badly damaging the Yorktown, which was later sunk. But Hiryu too was lost by the following day. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Gone, along with them hundreds of highly trained, experienced pilots who could not easily be replaced. Japan's capacity for offensive naval operations in the Pacific had been critically and permanently reduced. The tide in the Pacific had shifted. Nearly half a world away, in the scorching heat of the North African desert, another turning point was taking shape, though it would arrive through a very different kind of battle. Erwin Rommel, the German field marshal known as the Desert Fox, had carved a fearsome reputation across the Western Desert with his use of daring, fast-moving armoured tactics. His surprise attacks, his instinct for outmanoeuvring opponents, his willingness to press forward where others might hesitate, these qualities had earned him admiration even among the British forces he fought against. But by the autumn of 1942, the situation was changing. The British 8th Army now had a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, a man of very different temperament from Rommel. Where Rommel was audacious and improvisational, Montgomery was careful, methodical, and precise. He believed in preparing his forces thoroughly before committing them to battle. He studied the ground, managed his logistics with discipline, and refused to fight until he judged the conditions favourable. His critics would sometimes call him slow, but his approach was about to prove devastatingly effective. On the 23rd of October 1942, Montgomery launched a massive offensive near the railway halt of El Alamein in Egypt. For 12 days, the British 8th Army pressed forward against Rommel's German-Italian Panzer Armee Africa. By the 4th of November, the Axis forces were in full retreat, withdrawing across Egypt, back across Libya, and eventually all the way to the Tunisian border. The threat to the Suez Canal, that vital artery of British imperial supply and communication, had been lifted, and when Allied forces landed in French North Africa just days later, on the 8th of November, in the operation known as Torch, the Axis position in Africa was placed under pressure from 2 directions at once. The noose was beginning to tighten, but of all the battles of 1942 and into 1943, none would carry quite the weight, quite the symbolic and strategic gravity of what unfolded at Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Germany launched its Great Southern Offensive, driven in large part by a desperate need for fuel. More than a year of fighting across the immense Eastern Front had worn down Germany's oil reserves to a critical point. The oil fields of the Caucasus were the prize, but Hitler added another objective, one driven as much by symbolism as by strategy. He ordered his forces to capture the city that bore his great rival's name, Stalingrad. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus advanced eastward. By late summer, German forces had reached the city on the Volga, and then the fighting began in earnest. What unfolded in Stalingrad was unlike anything the war had yet produced. The Luftwaffe's bombers had already reduced much of the city to rubble, and it was in that rubble, those shattered factories, those collapsed apartment blocks, those debris-choked alleyways, that two enormous armies now fought one another at close quarters, floor by floor, room by room, sometimes occupying different levels of the same ruined building. German combined arms doctrine, the integration of air power, artillery and tanks that had been so effective in open country, was blunted and broken by the closeness of the urban terrain. The Soviet commander charged with holding the city was General Vasily Chuikov, who ordered his troops to maintain positions so close to the German lines that the Luftwaffe could not bomb Soviet positions without risk of striking their own men. His soldiers moved through the ruins in small lightly armed assault groups, ambushing German troops, exploiting the wreckage as cover, holding on with a stubborn, ferocious tenacity. The railway station changed hands dozens of times in a single day. Snipers haunted the ruins. Winters plunged the fighting into a grinding, freezing misery. And still the battle continued. Then, on the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets struck, not at the centre of the German line, but at its weakened Romanian flanks to the north and south of the city. In a double encirclement known as Operation Uranus, Soviet forces punched through the thinly held lines, raced westwards, and linked up at the town of Kalach on the Don River. The German Sixth Army, roughly 210,000 men, was encircled, trapped. Hitler forbade retreat. He forbade surrender. He promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, perhaps assuming that a man of such rank would fight to the death rather than yield. But by the end of January 1943, with his army starving, frozen and shattered, Friedrich Paulus surrendered, the first German field marshal in history to do so. Of the roughly 91,000 German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, only around 6,000 would ever return home. The psychological blow to Germany was immense. The myth of invincibility that Nazi propaganda had so carefully constructed had been shattered. Public faith in the party began to erode. Goebbels and Hitler attempted to frame the loss as heroic sacrifice, promised new weapons and new victories, but something had changed. The confidence that had carried Germany's early years of war was gone. And yet, even as these great battles played out in the open, on ocean waters, across desert sands, within the ruins of a city on the Volga, another war was being fought in the shadows. A quieter war, a war of secrets. At the heart of Germany's communications lay the Enigma machine, an electromechanical cipher device that its operators believed to be unbreakable. Messages encoded on Enigma passed through a system of rotating wheels, a plug board, and a reflector, generating an almost incomprehensible number of possible configurations. The machine had been developed in the years after the First World War, and by the time of the Second, the German military placed enormous faith in its security. That faith was misplaced. The Allies had been working on Enigma since at least the spring of 1940, when captured German vessels yielded intact machines and codebooks. These were brought to a quiet estate in the English countryside called Bletchley Park, where a remarkable collection of mathematicians, linguists, chess masters, and crossword solvers had gathered to wage war with their minds. Among them was Alan Turing, a British mathematician of extraordinary insight who designed an electromechanical device called the bomb. By testing vast numbers of possible Enigma settings against known or guessed fragments of plain text, the bomb could identify candidate configurations that operators could then verify. It was painstaking work, but it worked. The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was given the classification ultra secret, and the measures taken to protect it were as carefully constructed as any military deception. Information derived from ultra was attributed to aerial reconnaissance, to prisoner interrogations, to routine radio traffic monitoring. Senior commanders who received ultra intelligence understood that its source must never be revealed, that no action based on it could be taken in a way that might alert the Germans their ciphers had been broken. The practical effects of ultra were quietly profound. In the Battle of the Atlantic, decrypted Enigma traffic allowed convoy routes to be adjusted, keeping ships away from waiting U-boat wolf packs. The course of the battleship Bismarck was decoded, allowing British surface forces to intercept and sink her. Later in the war, ultra-intelligence would confirm the disposition of German forces in Sicily and Normandy, informing some of the most consequential decisions of the entire conflict. But signals intelligence was not the only shadow war being fought. In the occupied countries of Europe, ordinary men and women were living double lives, taking extraordinary risks in the name of resistance. In France, a network of clandestine cells had begun forming almost from the moment of the German occupation. These groups, Combat, Libération, Franc-Tireur and many others, were gradually unified under the quiet and extraordinary leadership of Jean Moulin, who acted as de Gaulle's representative within occupied France and linked the fragmented resistance networks into a more coherent national structure. The methods of the French resistance ranged from the printing of underground newspapers to the sabotage of railway lines and bridges, the forging of identity documents, the sheltering of downed Allied airmen, and the organisation of rural guerrilla bands known as the Maquis, who operated in the forests and hills and conducted armed ambushes against German forces. In Poland, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, had grown into the largest resistance organisation in occupied Europe, responsible for delivering an estimated 43% of all Allied intelligence reports from the continent and conducting massive sabotage operations against German rail lines supplying the Eastern Front. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito's partisans had developed into what many historians would later regard as Europe's most effective guerrilla force. A multi-ethnic, fiercely disciplined movement that tied down significant German forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. And in Germany itself, a loosely connected network the Gestapo called the Red Orchestra, Rote Kapelle, included figures such as Arvid von Harnack, an economist in the Ministry of Economics, his American-born wife Mildred Fish Harnack, and Harro Schulze-Boysen, an intelligence officer within the Luftwaffe itself. These individuals passed information to the Allies and worked quietly against the regime from within its own institutions, at enormous personal cost. High above all of this, literally above, that another dimension of the secret war was being prosecuted in the skies. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany had been underway since 1942, with the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command targeting German industrial cities by night and the American 8th Air Force striking by day. The objectives were broad: to destroy factories, disrupt rail lines, cripple fuel production, and erode Germany's capacity to sustain its war machine. But the campaign carried with it a profound moral weight. The debate between precision bombing and area bombing, or between striking specific military and industrial targets versus carpet bombing entire urban areas, was never fully resolved, and it left a shadow that endured long after the war's end. Advocates of area bombing, most prominently Sir Arthur Harris of RAF Bomber Command, argued that only overwhelming destruction could break German resistance. Critics contended that targeting civilian neighbourhoods crossed an ethical boundary that even the pressures of total war could not justify. One operation stood apart from the broad sweep of the strategic bombing campaign, specific, audacious, and almost impossibly daring. On the night of the 16th and 17th of May 1943, a specially formed Royal Air Force unit known as 617 Squadron flew low over Germany's Ruhr Valley carrying a remarkable weapon, Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bomb, designed to skip across the surface of a reservoir before sinking and exploding against a dam wall. The Möhne and Eder dams were breached. Flooding poured through the Ruhr Valley. Factories, power stations, and infrastructure were damaged. The disruption to Germany's armaments production lasted for months. The raid, soon to be known simply as the Dam Busters, provided a significant lift to Allied morale, even as it came at a considerable cost to the men who flew it. By the close of 1942 and into the early months of 1943, something had shifted across the whole vast landscape of the war. Midway had blunted Japan's offensive power. El Alamein had ended the Axis threat to the Suez Canal. Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility on land. And in the shadows, in the code-breaking rooms of Bletchley Park, in the forests where the Maquis sheltered, in the quiet heroism of men and women who passed secrets at great personal risk, another war had helped tilt the balance, without ever making a headline. The Allies were not yet victorious. The path ahead remained long and uncertain. Debates over where and when to open a true second front in Europe, an invasion in force across the English Channel, had persisted for years, driven by American urgency, British caution, and Soviet insistence, all held in an uneasy alliance of competing interests and shared necessity. The resources, the training, the logistics for such an undertaking were still being assembled. It would not come until 1944, but it was coming. The tide had turned, but the war was far from over, and as the Allies prepared to strike into the European heartland, a world of secret weapons, hidden treasures, and unfinished scientific nightmares waited in the shadows of occupied Europe. Chapter 5: Secrets, Shadows, and the Final Storm. D-Day, Nazi Mysteries, and the Fall of the Third Reich. By the summer of 1943, the shape of the war had begun to shift, slowly, like great stones settling after a tremor. The Allied forces, having endured years of loss and uncertainty, were beginning to press back against the Axis powers with a gathered and deliberate force. And the first decisive blow fell upon the sun-warmed shores of Sicily. On the night of the 9th of July 1943, a vast armada moved silently through the Mediterranean. American, British, Canadian, Free French, Australian and Greek forces descended upon the Italian island in what became known as Operation Husky, a combined amphibious and airborne assault of staggering scale. For 38 days the battle continued, until the island was fully taken. Key cities fell, Palermo, then Messina. The Mediterranean sea lanes, so long contested, were secured, and the cost to the Axis powers was severe, with roughly 165,000 casualties absorbed by the defending forces. But the consequences of Sicily reached far beyond the island itself. The swift Allied victory sent tremors through the heart of Rome. Benito Mussolini, who had ruled Italy with iron certainty for more than 2 decades, suddenly found the ground dissolving beneath him. On the night of the 24th of July, within the chambers of the fascist Grand Council, a man named Dino Grandi called for a vote. A quiet, formal measure that proposed the king resume his constitutional powers. The council voted 19-8 in favour. It was, in effect, a verdict against Mussolini himself. The following morning, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed the man who had once seemed untouchable, appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio in his place, and had Mussolini arrested as he stepped from the palace. The once feared dictator was sent first to the island prison of Ponza, then transferred further still. He remained captive there until German forces extracted him in September, and installed him as the figurehead of a German-backed government in the north of Italy. But his time was running out. In April of 1945, Italian partisans captured him, and on the 28th of that month he was executed. A long shadow had finally passed, yet the fighting in Italy itself would prove to be one of the war's most grueling and unrelenting campaigns. The Allied advance northward through the Italian peninsula, begun with landings at Salerno in September of 1943, would drag on until the very final days of the war, in May of 1945. The land itself seemed to resist every effort. The Apennine Mountains rose in dark, forbidding ridges. Rivers had to be bridged and bridged again. Mud swallowed vehicles and men alike through freezing winters. And the Germans, skilled and disciplined defenders, turned the terrain into a fortress, constructing successive lines of fortifications, the Gustav Line, the Hitler Line, bunkered and mined and reinforced with patience and precision. The Italian campaign became a slow, painful grinding of forces against geography and will, each small advance costing dearly in lives. While the Italian front wore on, the minds of Allied planners were fixed upon something far larger, a gamble so enormous that its failure could have prolonged the war by years. The Allies called it Operation Overlord. Its purpose was nothing less than the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe through the coast of France, and its execution required not only immense force, but extraordinary deception. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December of 1943, bore the weight of coordination. He oversaw the integration of land, sea, and air forces drawn from across the Allied world. He approved the selection of Normandy as the landing site. He resolved disputes, made decisions, and on the morning of June the 6th, 1944, he sent 156,000 men towards the shores of France. But before a single soldier touched the beach, an extraordinary theatre of illusion had been performed. Operation Bodyguard, the Allied strategic deception, had been quietly running for months. A phantom army was conjured from nothing. The first United States Army group, known as FUSAG, stationed in southeast England and populated with inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, fabricated radio traffic, and the reports of carefully managed double agents. And placed at its fictional head was General George S. Patton, a commander so feared and respected by the German High Command that his imagined presence convinced them the real invasion would strike at the Pas de Calais. When the landings came at Normandy, German forces elsewhere remained frozen, waiting for the blow that never came. The deception held for weeks after D-Day itself, delaying reinforcement and multiplying the value of every Allied soldier who set foot on French soil. 5 beaches had been chosen. Utah and Omaha were assigned to American forces. Gold and Sword would be taken by the British. Juno was the Canadian sector. On most of these beaches, despite fierce resistance, the men found footholds and pushed inland through the long hours of that June morning. But at Omaha, something closer to catastrophe unfolded. The American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions came ashore to find the German 352nd Infantry Division entrenched in fortified strongpoints along the bluffs above the beach. Navigation errors had concentrated men in the wrong places. Artillery and aerial bombardment had failed to silence the defences. Across 300 yards of open sand, under fire from positions commanding every angle, the first waves of men were cut down in terrible numbers. Casualties at Omaha alone were reported between 2,400 and more than 6,000 killed, wounded or missing. The beach was taken, but at a price that still weighs upon the memory of those days. On the eastern flank, paratroopers and glider-borne troops had descended in the dark hours before the seaborne landings, tasked with seizing bridges and neutralizing threats. Among the objectives was a small structure spanning the Caen Canal, a bridge that would come to be called Pegasus Bridge. Its capture intact secured the eastern flank of Sword Beach, denied the Germans a swift crossing point for armoured counterattacks, and linked the airborne troops with the men coming in from the sea. It was a quiet but essential piece of a vast puzzle. In total, the first day of the Normandy landings cost the Allies approximately 10,250 casualties, including around 4,400 killed. And yet the beaches were held. The lodgment had been made. The weeks that followed were filled with bitter fighting among the hedgerows and fields of Normandy. British and Canadian forces pressed toward Caen through Operations Epsom and Goodwood, drawing German reserves and absorbing fierce counterattacks. American forces drove to seize Cherbourg and its harbour. Then, at the end of July, came Operation Cobra, a massive American offensive that punched through the German lines and sent armoured columns racing toward Avranches. The breakout had begun. A German counterattack at Mortain was broken by Allied air power. German forces in Normandy were encircled at Falaise in mid-August, sustaining devastating losses. And as August drew toward its close, a city long held in the shadow of occupation began to stir. Paris rose on the 19th of August 1944. The French forces of the interior seized key positions throughout the city, and on the night of the 24th, the 1st Allied armoured columns, the 2nd French Armoured Division under General Philippe Leclerc, slipped into the streets and reached the Hôtel de Ville. The following morning, American forces arrived. The German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Coltitz, surrendered at the Hôtel Le Maurice. General Charles de Gaulle entered the liberated capital, and a city breathed again. But the war was not yet over. and not every Allied thrust would succeed so cleanly. In September, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery devised an ambitious plan to seize a series of bridges across the rivers of the Netherlands, culminating in a crossing of the Rhine at Arnhem. Operation Market Garden launched on the 17th of September 1944. Airborne troops descended on Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem. But at Arnhem, 2 SS Panzer divisions were resting nearby, and they reacted with speed and force. The bridge could not be held. Supply lines were cut. The Allied advance stalled and was abandoned, leaving heavy casualties and the Rhine still in German hands. Then, in the deep cold of December, Germany made one final desperate gamble. On the 16th of that month, Adolf Hitler launched an offensive through the Ardennes, the forested, hilly region of Belgium and Luxembourg, aimed at splitting the Allied armies, capturing the port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace in the west. It was a last, exhausted lunge at survival. The surprise was real, and German columns drove forward through the initial shock, creating the great bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. At the road junction of Bastogne, Belgium, the American 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. When the Germans demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. The defenders held. On the 26th of December, elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through from the south, ending the siege. The German offensive collapsed, and what remained of Germany's reserve strength had been spent. As 1945 arrived, the Allied armies crossed the Rhine at multiple points and fanned out across Western Germany. In the east, the Soviet Union's armies were already deep within German territory, driving toward Berlin with overwhelming force. All through these final years, Germany had reached for secret weapons that might yet change the tide. From the research complex at Peenemünde on the remote Baltic coast, engineers under Wernher von Braun had developed the world's first guided ballistic missile, the V2, a weapon that struck without warning, falling from the edge of space at supersonic speed, silent until the moment of destruction. The earlier V1, a pulse-jet flying bomb whose distinctive droning engine cut out just before impact, had terrorized London since June of 1944. Together, these weapons killed and wounded tens of thousands of civilians and forced vast evacuations, though they were introduced too late and in too limited numbers to alter the outcome of the war. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, offered another glimpse of what might have been. Capable of outrunning every Allied propeller aircraft in the sky, it entered service in mid-1944, but chronic engine shortages, Allied bombing of production facilities, fuel scarcity, and Hitler's insistence on deploying it as a bomber rather than a fighter delayed and diminished its impact. The jets were frequently destroyed on the ground or during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, and the war ended before they could be fielded in decisive numbers. Deeper still, in laboratories spread across 9 institutes, German physicists had pursued the possibility of an atomic weapon, the Uranverein or Uranium Club, a research effort that began in the spring of 1939 following the discovery of nuclear fission. Werner Heisenberg, Kurt Diebner and others worked toward a nuclear reactor and the theoretical basis for a bomb. But the program was fractured by rivalry, starved of resources, and critically misled by faulty calculations. Heisenberg initially estimated the critical mass required at many tons, far beyond what was actually needed. The exile and murder of Jewish physicists, Allied destruction of heavy water production in Norway, and a bureaucratic demotion of the entire effort from military to civilian status all combined to ensure that Germany never came close to a functional atomic weapon. The farm hall interrogations conducted after the war confirmed it, and through all of this, stranger currents ran beneath the surface of the Nazi state. In July of 1935, Heinrich Himmler had founded the Ahnenerbe, a pseudo-scientific institute devoted to fabricating evidence of an ancient Aryan heritage through archaeology, anthropology, and occult study. Its expeditions ranged across Iceland, Karelia, Sweden, and Tibet, measuring skulls, cataloguing petroglyphs, and searching for mythological sites that could lend the regime a sense of ancient destiny. The Institute looked to Norse mythology and runic symbolism to construct a narrative of racial and spiritual superiority. The swastika, the Siegrune, the imagery of Odin and Thor, all bent into the service of propaganda and power. And then there was the mystery that has never been fully explained. On the night of the 10th of May 1941, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, climbed alone into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 at Augsburg and flew to Scotland. He parachuted near Eaglesham, was captured, and claimed he was on a personal mission to negotiate peace with Britain. Hitler, it is said, never approved the flight. Whether Hess acted on some private conviction about a shared Anglo-Saxon destiny, whether he believed he had secret contacts in Britain willing to deal, or whether the entire episode involved intelligence operations still not fully disclosed, none of this has ever been conclusively established. The flight remains one of the war's enduring enigmas. Equally mysterious are the treasures that vanished in the war's final chaos. The Nazi looting of European art was systematic and vast. More than 500,000 objects seized from Poland alone, representing nearly 43% of that country's cultural heritage. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts and artifacts were stripped from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and every occupied land. Much was recovered after the war, but much was not. Among the losses was a chamber of almost dreamlike beauty, the Amber Room, whose walls had been fashioned from intricately carved amber panels, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, originally created for Prussia and later installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. German forces seized it in 1941 and moved it to Königsberg. After that it disappeared. Searches have continued for decades. Soviet investigations, German-Russian expeditions, archaeological surveys of the ruins of Königsberg Castle, and expeditions into suspected bunkers in Poland. A full-scale reconstruction was completed at the Catherine Palace in 2003, a replica of extraordinary craftsmanship. But the original has never been found, and most experts believe it still rests somewhere beneath the Kaliningrad region, sealed in a cellar or tunnel that the years have hidden well. Legend also speaks of a great armoured train that departed the city of Breslau in the war's final weeks, laden with gold, silver, jewels and artworks, possibly including fragments of the Amber Room itself, and was concealed in a tunnel somewhere in the Owl Mountains of Poland. Investigations have been launched again and again, most dramatically in 2015 when ground-penetrating radar seemed to reveal something buried near Wałbrzych. The excavation found nothing conclusive. Historians consider the story most likely a myth, though the legend persists with a quiet tenacity. The Nazi regime also constructed an underground world of its own, driven into the earth by the forced labour of concentration camp prisoners. The Mittelwerk, carved into the gypsum mines near Nordhausen, became an enormous subterranean factory where V-2 missiles were assembled under conditions of profound human suffering. Tunnels and bunkers spread beneath the German landscape, hiding factories, command posts, and armament works from Allied bombers. These dark passages were, in a sense, the final refuge of a regime retreating from the light. And then came the last days of Berlin. The Soviet offensive against the German capital began on the 16th of April 1945. The Red Army closed around the city in a vast encirclement, and the fighting moved street by street, building by building, through the ruins of what had once been a grand capital. In a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler spent his final days. Soviet artillery shook the ground above him. Reports of advancing armies reached him in fragments. On the 29th of April, he married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. He had his dog poisoned to test the cyanide capsules he intended to use. He said farewell to those who remained. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, shooting himself while biting down on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun died of cyanide poisoning beside him. Their bodies were carried to the garden of the Chancellery, doused with petrol, and burned as Soviet shells continued to fall. Soviet troops later recovered the remains and conducted forensic examinations that confirmed the cause of death. Witness testimonies and subsequent judicial investigations further established the facts. An official death certificate was issued in 1956. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender was formalised. All German forces on land, sea, and in the air were ordered to cease hostilities, to remain in their positions, to disarm completely, and to hand over all weapons and equipment to the designated Allied commanders. The war in Europe was over. But in the weeks before the surrender, Allied soldiers moving through Germany and Poland had begun to discover what the Nazi state had concealed and what it had done. In liberated concentration camps, they found emaciated survivors, mountains of personal belongings, gas chambers, crematoria, and mass graves. They photographed and recorded and testified. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 11 million people, among them 6 million Jews and 5 million others, including Roma, the disabled Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual men and political opponents, was brought into the full and terrible light of the world. The evidence gathered became the foundation of the Nuremberg trials and the beginning of a reckoning that has never fully ended. Europe had fallen into silence after 6 years of unimaginable destruction, but the war was not yet over. And thousands of miles to the east, a different kind of ending was being prepared. One that would not only conclude this war, but permanently alter the nature of all wars to come. Chapter 6. The Atomic Age and the Long Shadow, Pacific War, Hiroshima, Cold War Origins, and Unresolved Mysteries. In the long, slow unfolding of the Second World War, the Pacific theatre carried its own particular weight. A vastness of ocean jungle and volcanic stone that swallowed armies whole and returned nothing but silence. By the middle of 1942, after the pivotal naval battle near the island of Midway, the tide had begun quietly and almost imperceptibly to turn. What followed was not a swift victory, but a long and deliberate march across the water, island by island, each one harder than the last. The first great test of this march came at Guadalcanal, a humid and rain-soaked island in the southern Solomon Islands. From August of 1942 through February of 1943, American Marines, Army soldiers, and naval forces fought across jungles and beaches and contested skies for 6 grinding months. It was the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. When it was over, the Japanese expansion toward Australia had been stopped, and the initiative, that invisible but precious weight in any great conflict, had shifted into American hands. Japan's veteran carrier pilots, many of them irreplaceable, had been spent and lost over those tropical waters. From Guadalcanal, the strategy that would carry the Allies across the Pacific took shape. It was called island hopping, a careful, selective plan devised by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, in which certain Japanese-held islands would be seized for their airfields and harbour positions, while others, too heavily fortified and too costly to take directly, would simply be bypassed and left to wither. Each captured island became the foundation for the next advance, drawing the front line steadily northward and westward, toward Japan itself. But the islands that lay along that path did not surrender gently. At Tarawa, in November of 1943, American forces attempted the first large-scale Central Pacific amphibious assault, landing on a small, heavily fortified islet called Betio. The coral reefs caught the landing craft. The concrete bunkers held. In less than 4 days, nearly 1,000 Americans were killed and more than 2,000 wounded, while the Japanese garrison of roughly 4,500 was almost entirely annihilated. The lessons were terrible and necessary. At Saipan, in the summer of 1944, 3 American divisions clawed their way across an island of rugged terrain and tunnel networks. Nearly 3,000 Americans died there. 29,000 Japanese were killed, and barely 1,000 taken prisoner. The capture of the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, was of enormous strategic importance, for it placed the great B-29 Superfortress bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands for the first time. And in the waters nearby, the Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed what remained of Japan's carrier air power, in an engagement that would come to be known, with a certain grim familiarity, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By October of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had eliminated what was left of Japan's naval striking capability, opening the Philippines to liberation. The Japanese surface fleet, once the mightiest in Asia, would never fight again as a coherent force. Then came Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island of black sand and sulphurous earth, in February of 1945. For 36 days, American Marines fought through an island carved hollow from beneath, a labyrinth of underground tunnels, hidden gun positions, and camouflaged emplacements. They fought with flamethrowers and grenades, inch by inch across terrain that seemed to resist them at every step. More than 6,800 Americans were killed. Over 21,000 Japanese defenders died, with only 216 taken prisoner. On the 23rd of February, a group of Marines raised an American flag atop the summit of Mount Suribachi. The photograph taken in that moment, men straining against wind and volcanic earth to plant a flag, became one of the most reproduced images of the entire war, a symbol of sacrifice and endurance that later served as the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. Okinawa followed, the largest and bloodiest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, fought from April through June of 1945, involving 5 Army and 2 Marine divisions against a Japanese defence built deep into the island's limestone ridges and underground command centres. Kamikaze aircraft struck the fleet in relentless waves. The fighting lasted 82 days. More than 12,000 Americans were killed. Japanese military casualties reached approximately 77,000, and civilian losses were catastrophic. Okinawa told the American leadership something they had quietly feared, that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost, by some estimates, between 1.5 and 4 million lives, Allied and Japanese combined. The island campaigns had provided forward bases. They had also provided a reckoning. While Marines crossed the islands high in the sky above Japanese cities, a different kind of war was being waged. In early 1945, General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas and made a decisive change in strategy. He stripped the B-29 super fortresses of their defensive armament, loaded them with incendiary bombs, and sent them in low, at night, at altitudes between 5 and 10,000 feet. On the night of the 9th and 10th of March 1945, the bombers reached Tokyo. What followed was Operation Meeting House. 1,665 tons of napalm and incendiaries fell across the city. Roughly 40% of Tokyo burned. An estimated 80 to 100,000 people were killed. 1 million were left without shelter. By summer, 64 Japanese cities had been reduced to ash and ruin by similar raids. Incendiary bombs comprising 3/4 of all munitions dropped. Yet Japan did not surrender. The weapon that would force the final decision had been conceived years earlier, in a summer of extraordinary anxiety. In August of 1939, the physicist Albert Einstein signed a letter drafted by Leo Szilard, with contributions from Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner. The letter, addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warned that recent work in nuclear fission suggested Nazi Germany might be moving toward the development of an atomic weapon. Roosevelt acted, convening a panel of physicists and allocating federal funds for research. From those modest beginnings grew the Manhattan Project, officially established on the 13th of August 1942, the largest and most secret scientific undertaking in history. The project stretched across the American continent. At Oak Ridge in Tennessee, uranium was enriched. At Hanford in Washington, plutonium was produced. At the University of Chicago, a team under Enrico Fermi achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. And in the mountains of New Mexico, at a remote mesa called Los Alamos, the weapons themselves were designed and built under the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Around him gathered some of the finest minds of the age: Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, Klaus Fuchs, and many others, all working in conditions of absolute secrecy toward a goal that would change the nature of war itself. On the 16th of July 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the world's first nuclear weapon was detonated. The test, called Trinity, took place at 5:29 in the morning. A plutonium implosion device, nicknamed the Gadget, exploded with the force of roughly 20 kilotons of TNT. The tower that had held it was vaporized. The sand beneath it was fused into glass. The light of the explosion was visible for hundreds of miles. Oppenheimer, watching from a distance, reportedly recalled a verse from ancient Hindu scripture: "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Harry S. Truman and his advisors faced a decision of extraordinary gravity. They had considered 4 paths: continue the strategic bombing of Japan, launch a full-scale invasion of the home islands, demonstrate the new weapon on an uninhabited area, or use it directly against a Japanese city. Weighing the projected casualties of an invasion, the desire to end the war before Soviet influence could expand further into Asia, and the need to deliver a psychological shock sufficient to compel surrender, they chose the city strike. Hiroshima was selected, largely untouched by prior firebombing, a centre of military production, and free of certain cultural monuments that might complicate the choice. At 2:45 in the morning of the 6th of August 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from the island of Tinian. At 8:15 in the morning over Hiroshima, a uranium fission bomb called Little Boy detonated 600 meters above the city. Approximately 70,000 people were killed outright by the blast and heat. In the weeks and months that followed, as radiation sickness spread through the survivors, the death toll climbed. By the end of 1945, between 120,000 and 130,000 people had died. On the 8th of August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, as had been agreed at earlier Allied conferences. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria within hours, crushing the Japanese Kwantung Army and opening a massive northern front. Japan's last hope of using Moscow as a neutral intermediary was gone. On the 9th of August, a second bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium device, fell on Nagasaki. The primary target that day had been the city of Kokura, but cloud cover had obscured it, and the aircraft diverted to Nagasaki. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people were killed. The industrial city, home to Mitsubishi factories and a major shipping hub, burned. On the 9th of August, Emperor Hirohito convened the Supreme Council of State. The debate was fierce. War Minister Korechika Anami and other military leaders spoke of continued resistance, but the emperor concluded that further fighting would bring only further devastation, and he gave his assent to surrender, one that would preserve the imperial institution. On the 15th of August, his recorded voice was broadcast to the nation. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the instrument of surrender was signed by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Uematsu. The Second World War was over. The moral weight of those August days has never fully settled. Those who supported the decision to use atomic weapons argued that the bombs forced a swift surrender, ending the war in weeks rather than the months or years an invasion would have required, sparing the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and millions of Japanese who would have died in the fighting and its attendant famine. Those who questioned the decision pointed to the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, to the possibility that Japan was already near surrender, to the possibility that a demonstration on an uninhabited area might have been sufficient, and to the suggestion that political calculations, the desire to intimidate the Soviet Union, the need to justify the enormous expense of the Manhattan Project, played a role alongside purely military judgment. The historical debate continues, and the weight of it remains, as perhaps it should. In Europe, justice was being pursued. The Nuremberg trials, beginning on the 20th of November 1945 and concluding in October of 1946, brought 24 of the most senior Nazi defendants before an international military tribunal. 4 charges were brought: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, the waging of aggressive war, war crimes and crimes against humanity. 12 were sentenced to death. 3 received life imprisonment. 4 received long prison terms. 3 were acquitted. The trials established something that had never before been so clearly articulated in law, that individuals bear personal criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity, even when those acts are permitted or commanded by their own government. International duty, the tribunal affirmed, supersedes national law. But not all who had served the Nazi regime faced justice. In a covert program called Operation Paperclip, the United States quietly recruited approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of them former Nazi Party members, to work for American military and scientific projects. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Von Braun and his colleagues brought with them the engineering knowledge that would eventually power the Saturn V rocket and carry American astronauts to the moon. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, acquired comparable German expertise through its own means. The technology born at the German research centre of Peenemünde, designed to rain destruction on London, became the foundation of the space race. The ethical questions surrounding Operation Paperclip have never been fully resolved. Early critics, including Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt, warned that employing former Nazis violated basic principles of justice. Later generations of historians have continued to debate whether the perceived strategic imperatives of the Cold War could justify the moral compromises made, or whether it represented an ethical amnesia in the face of geopolitical rivalry. The war's end created a new world and a new rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union, wartime allies of necessity, emerged as the 2 dominant global powers from the wreckage of a continent. Europe was divided into spheres of influence. Germany itself was partitioned into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with the capital Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, divided similarly among the same 4 powers. The Soviet Union imposed communist governments across Eastern Europe. The United States promoted democratic reconstruction in the West, funneling more than $15 billion into the recovery of 16 Western European nations through the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt cities, modernized industry, and helped stanch the spread of Soviet-backed communism. In 1948, the Soviets closed all land, rail, and water routes into the western-occupied sectors of Berlin. The Berlin blockade lasted nearly a year. The Allied response was not military confrontation, but a sustained miracle of logistics. The Berlin airlift, codenamed Operation Vittles, during which Allied aircraft flew round the clock, landing at Tempelhof Airport at times nearly once every minute, delivering food, coal, medicine, and fuel to the city below. At its peak, over 2 million tons of cargo had been flown in across 11 months. The Soviet Union lifted the blockade in May of 1949. The United Nations was formally established on the 24th of October, 1945, with the expressed purposes of maintaining international peace and security, fostering cooperation among nations, and serving as a centre for harmonising the actions of states in pursuit of common human goals. It was an institution born directly from the ashes of the war, designed to prevent what had just occurred from ever occurring again. The war's reach extended in other directions as well. The firebombing of cities and the targeting of civilian populations accelerated the eventual collapse of European colonial empires, as exhausted metropolitan powers could no longer maintain overseas territories, and colonized peoples who had fought alongside their rulers returned home with expectations of political rights that could no longer be denied. The war's medical and scientific legacies were similarly vast. Penicillin was mass-produced for the first time. Blood banking was developed and systematized. The first chemotherapy treatments grew from research on toxic gases. Radar became the foundation of weather forecasting. The first electronic computers laid the groundwork for the digital age. The Manhattan Project itself inaugurated the nuclear era, a world in which the potential for total destruction existed alongside the architecture of international institutions designed, however imperfectly, to prevent it. And still there are mysteries that the years have not resolved. The Amber Room, an ornate chamber of carved amber panels looted from the Catherine Palace near Leningrad in 1941, has never been found. Approximately 100,000 artworks stolen by the Nazis remain missing. The Peking Man fossils, packed for shipment to America in 1941, vanished and were never recovered. Declassified documents released in recent decades have revealed that Allied leaders possessed more foreknowledge of both the Holocaust and the Pearl Harbor attack than was long believed, prompting historians to revisit the adequacy of the responses made at the time. The total cost of the war, measured in lives, reaches towards 75 million, 20 million of them soldiers, 55 million of them civilians. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million. China lost approximately 20 million. Germany lost between 6 and 8 million. Japan lost nearly 3 million. The economic cost exceeded $4 trillion by modern reckoning. These are numbers that resist full comprehension, and perhaps that is by their nature. The scale of what happened in those years from 1939 to 1945 exceeds the ordinary boundaries of understanding. What the war left behind was not merely ruins and graves. It left behind institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the foundations of the European Union, designed to channel the rivalries of nations into something less catastrophic than open conflict. It left behind legal principles that crimes against humanity are answerable to international law, that continue to shape courts and tribunals to this day. It left behind a nuclear world and the long shadow of deterrence that has defined the decades since. It left behind questions that archives have not yet fully answered, and that historians continue to pursue across testimony, declassified records, and the slowly yielding earth. The guns fell silent, the flags were lowered, and the world began the long and unfinished work of understanding what it had just survived. But some questions from those years of darkness will never be fully answered, and perhaps that is what keeps history alive.